Philip, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me here to say a few brief words in this panel. I want to make three sets of comments. I'd first like to pick up a core theme in the roadmap and in the advisory committee report, which is the theme of what everybody else is going to do or is not doing, and how that relates to what the EU is going to do. In other words, I want to remind us of how serious the context is for climate change within which the roadmap's ambitions are set. Secondly, I want to make some remarks about the roadmap itself and some of its components. And thirdly, to make some remarks about where we go now, what's next, to pick up some of the themes that Philip had on his last slide. So let me start with the context. And the context is pretty bleak. There is no evidence whatsoever that anything substantive has been done about climate change at the global level since 1990. The emissions march ever up, 2 parts per million per annum. And it has to be said that the Kyoto efforts that people have made have so far made not a dent in that projection of emission growth. The IEA, who were part of our advisory group, the recent report indicates that if you read, actually just read the text, but if you read between the lines, there is now very little prospect of holding climate change to 2 degrees. We are now in the business of thinking about what we're going to do in a world which might be substantially hotter than 2 degrees. That is a wake-up call for everybody. And if you look behind that growth of emissions, you don't look to what's happened in Europe. You look to the rising coal burn internationally, from 25 to nearly 30% share of world energy. And last year, for example, China's coal burn went up 9%. That's what we have to have in mind. It's global warming that we are supposed to be focused on. And of course, the roadmap has to make a contribution to global warming, not just European warming or particular country warming. The second observation, which is linked to that, is that what arguably really matters for Europe's contribution to global warming is Europe's carbon consumption, not its carbon production. Carbon consumption adjusts for the imports and exports of carbon-intensive goods, and once you do that and recognise that for the last 20 years much of Europe has been on a deindustrialisation path, and in particular a gradual exit from energy-intensive industries, you recognise that while it looks like our production of carbon has been going down, the 2020 targets, that's not true of our carbon consumption. So take a country like Britain. You're probably, many of you, sick and tired of British people trumpeting their achievements. But our politicians say that we're in the vanguard of climate change action because between 1990 and 2005 we reduced our carbon production by 15%. Sounds great. Well, I've recalculated the numbers to take account of the deindustrialisation process and looked at the import content of the things we used to produce, like steel and chemicals, etc., which are now imported from elsewhere. And I can tell you that our carbon consumption in that period went up 19%. It's different for different European countries, but as we note in our advisory report, carbon consumption needs to be taken into account. We didn't agree about whether our targets in Europe should be written explicitly in carbon consumption terms, but the fact that carbon consumption has been going up while carbon production has been going down explains why actually we've had very little effect on global warming and emissions so far. And the third fact from the outside world in which the roadmap has to be set is what's been going on in fossil fuel markets. It is widely assumed that the fossil fuel price is going to go ever up, it's going to be volatile, and therefore lots of low carbon technologies are going to become economic. Indeed, the last Secretary of State in the UK a year ago thought that oil prices were going to double. Well, if they're going to double, we can remove the subsidies from renewables now, because they're going to be competitive. But the stark reality is that the gas price in the US today is 2.5. It's between 10 and 12 in Europe and 6 and 7 in China. This is a staggering change in world energy markets, and my real fear is not that we're going to run out of oil and gas and the price is going to rise, but we've got far too much oil and gas, plenty of reserves, there is no peak oil, there is no peak gas, and the consequence is going to be not that we're going to be rescued in our low carbon technologies by high carbon fuel prices, but quite the reverse. And this has radical implications for carbon consumption, where energy intensive industries are going to go, and how we address this very serious international climate change problem. So I'm afraid, from a climate change perspective, when we think about what we're going to do in Europe and the roadmap, what we have to be is coldly realistic, look at the facts and realise that it's pretty bleak. And remember the triumph at Durban. Just remind ourselves of what was achieved. What was achieved was that we agreed that we will try to agree by 2015 what we might do after 2020. May I remind you that between now and 2020, the Chinese and the Indian economies will both double in size on current growth projections. I leave out Indonesia and a whole series of other countries. So the world where we're going to try to apply these targets, in which other countries are going to hopefully participate, is one where two of the major growing emitters will be twice their current size. That's a wake-up call for the scale of the challenge. Now, in this context, the roadmap makes very considerable contributions. The first and most important thing is it's not been captured by lobbyists, it's not full of hype, it's coldly realistic, practical, and it does not try to provide any single unique roadmap or path to 250. It recognises the future lacks predictability. It recognises there are all sorts of things that can happen over that time period, and that leads to the clause or sentence in the roadmap, which I personally think is extraordinarily important but is not picked up in the debate. It says the aim is to have a technologically neutral roadmap plan and strategy for Europe. Not picking winners, not picking particular technologies, but recognising that probably all the technologies have a role to play, and it's not the job of the Commission or policymakers to decide which technology goes where in what amounts. The point that I would disagree with the roadmap, and it links to my point about the observation about international prices, is the observation about the costs of the transition, and in particular the relative costs of this transition compared with what other people might be doing elsewhere. I simply do not believe that in a context in which the relative price of fossil fuels may be rather different, that this is going to be cheap. And I think it beholds our politicians and our leaders to tell the public some fundamental truths about the scale of the switch from a carbon to a low carbon economy, and the fact that it's probably unlikely that that could be achieved without substantial impacts on people's standards of living. I think that is a core environmental message which people should take forward. And I find it, in principle, hard to conclude that all the different pathways could come up with roughly the same costs. It would be nice if it was true. I can see why people might want to believe it, but concern about the modelling, the role of modelling over that time period, and the underlying assumptions lead me to be sceptical. Which brings me to what next, and some conclusions. The roadmap is extremely sensible in spelling out what's next. If you pick out the themes, first of all, infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure is a core theme. Under virtually any scenario, including one in which we don't do much about climate change and just worry about security of supply and competitiveness, infrastructure is a good idea. And taking that forward on a European rather than a national basis seems to me extremely important. Secondly, there is an emphasis on the carbon price and the role of markets. There's clearly a debate and indeed we had that debate in the advisory committee between those who see the markets, the price of carbon, and especially border carbon adjustments so that we address our carbon consumption rather than just our carbon production within Europe as a core route, and others who think that the Commission should define more technologically specific pathways. The two are not completely compatible, and the more uncertain you think the future lies, the more scope you think there are for new technologies, the more you should worry about picking winners. And you should remember the old adage, it's not so much that government pick winners, it's losers pick governments. The lobbying effort of different technologies is really quite endemic. And that leads to the other component which appears in the roadmap, and that we stress too, which is R&D. There is a plethora of future technologies out there. If I had, when I'd been doing my doctoral thesis on my Olympic portable typewriter with Tipex and carbon paper, had written the communications industry the next 40 years, it would look like complete rubbish today. The reason is technical change transformed a whole set of industries. And what we have going on in the energy industry, and it's very good news, is a whole plethora of new technologies coming down the track. So there are grounds, even if we are pessimistic about the world's position now and what we haven't achieved so far, for a lot of optimism going forward. But that leads to the final challenge, which is implicit and explicit throughout the roadmap, but not answered. Where's the investment coming from? Who's going to finance it? And how do you keep the cost of capital down? Those, ladies and gentlemen, are practical questions which I leave you with. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dieter. Your habitual dose of realism, scepticism and practicality. Tina.